New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello, I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today, we'll be exploring the flicker filter model of consciousness. With me is Professor Imants Barušs, who is Professor of Psychology at King's University College at Western University, Canada in London, Ontario, where he's been teaching courses on consciousness for more than 30 years. He is also author of Authentic Knowing, the Convergence of Science and Spiritual Aspiration, and Alterations of Consciousness, an empirical analysis for social scientists. Most recently, he is co-author with Julian Mossbridge, who has been a recent guest on the New Thinking Aloud channel, of an important book published by the American Psychological Association called Transcendent Mind, Rethinking the Science of Consciousness. This interview is being conducted over the internet, so now I'm going to switch over to the Skype video. Welcome, Imants. It's a pleasure to be with you. I want to congratulate you once again on getting the American Psychological Association to publish the book you co-authored with Julian Mossbridge, Transcendent Mind. And for me, the highlight of that book really is your flicker filter model of consciousness. So I know we're going to be focusing in on that, but it takes a while to sort of create the context for it, but perhaps you could just summarize the theory in a few words, and then we'll dance around it, so to speak.
Sure. Well, thanks, Jeffrey. I really appreciate you interviewing me. I've always really liked your work, and I think it's a real service that you do for the consciousness community to be able to do these interviews and to make them available to people so that people can actually know what it is that we do. So I think that that's a real tribute to you that you've been able to do this for all these years. And I have used the original Thinking Aloud series, for example. I've used in my classrooms as well. So it's good to be here.
Well, thank you. It's a real pleasure to be with you as well. I've been aware of your work for a long time, and you've been teaching consciousness now for over 30 years. So you're really one of the important pioneers in the field, and I do think your book, Transcendent Mind, is a real landmark.
Well, we hope so. I mean, we were trying to sort of put down an anchor, or to create kind of I don't know what other word would work as well as anchor. Like basically put down an anchor at a particular place so that you've actually made some headway. Mm-hmm. Because otherwise it's just you're always sort of starting from zero, right?
And the flicker filter model that we'll be talking about really is something of an anchor in that regard, because it offers researchers a whole new way of looking at consciousness.
I think first of all, it's not really that unique if you look at what other people have done. Mm-hmm. It's sort of another variation on a theme that's been arising frequently, I think, in the last 100 years or so. So basically, just to summarize the model, if you're going to move away from materialism, then the question arises, well, how are we going to explain things? Like, what kind of explanatory schemes will we have for that? And I think that's been one of the charges that's been made. Well, there aren't any. Therefore, you've got nothing. You have to stick with materialism because there are no alternatives.
Yeah, almost by definition, I think from the materialist point of view, if it's not material, then it's not science.
Well, yeah, that's a conflation of two completely different things. Materialism is a theory, and science is a way of acquiring knowledge. So, and in fact, it's science that has undermined materialism. Yeah. So, but it basically put it out of commission. So there are two ingredients in the flicker filter theory. The first of those is the notion of the flicker. And this isn't really, a novel idea. People have proposed this idea in the past, more or less jokingly, though, that maybe the universe turns itself on and off all the time. But when Julie and I started looking carefully at Julian Barbour's theory of time, he has a theory whereby time consists of sequences of nows. And those nows sit in a big pile somewhere. And then they come down out of that pile in some kind of order that's determined by some sort of probability density function or whatever. And so that kind of went along with ideas that I already had from looking at the measurement problem in quantum mechanics. And there are theorems in quantum mechanics basically that say that if you continuously observe a system, it won't change. So that means that you have to release your observation in effect. Then the question is, well, how does that translate over to ordinary life? I mean, we're not talking here about making formal experimental observations in physics. We're talking about everyday life. And so it seemed to me that sort of, to cut a long story short, that the way that could happen is if the universe itself kept turning on and off. And so then you've got this idea of these successions of nows that sort of show up and disappear, show up and disappear.
It seems as if you're applying the principle of the quantum to time. You're talking about, in effect, quantums of time.
Yes, and there is something called Planck time. And within the time span of Planck time cannot be distinguished. And so in one of my papers, I proposed the idea that maybe the universe turns itself on and off once per Planck time. Mm-hmm. So in other words, that it is quantized. Time is quantized.
And then there's sort of a space in between the quantums.
Well, yeah, who knows? I mean, who knows what that means, right?
Yeah.
Because once you get away from the idea of sort of this linearly ordered time, that as we experience it, both clock time and subjective time, then basically everything is up for grabs again. Mm-hmm. Then you have to try to figure it all out, and that's challenging and it's interesting. And Julie and I had a lot of fun with it.
Yeah, but essentially, the flicker part of the flicker filter model is the idea that the universe recreates itself instant by instant.
Right. That's exactly it. Mm-hmm. And notice one of the first consequences. Why should it recreate itself the way it already was? And that's where the theory of meaning fields comes in, that which isn't in the book, by the way. I developed those after writing the book. But the idea that there are these fields that hold the patterns of what is going to happen. And that has powerful implications, because if you start thinking that we can switch between meaning fields, then that means that you can switch what happens in physical reality from now to now. Mm-hmm.
And so let's talk about for the filter aspect of the flicker filter model.
The filter is perhaps better known in the literature in that the idea is very simple, that maybe the brain somehow is not the source of consciousness, but maybe all it's doing is it's a channel or a relay station, or almost like a block or a filter or some kind of device that attenuates and constricts and restricts consciousness itself.
Mm-hmm.
And that consciousness is not primarily or fundamentally of the brain. It works through the brain, but that's not where it comes from, and that's not its primary identity. So the notion now is that there is some kind of deep consciousness or some kind of pre-physical substrate or some kind of realm in which ordinary time does not function, ordinary space does not function, the ordinary rules of physics as we understand them don't function. And that pre-physical substrate is the sort of the source for where the nows come from, and the sort of all the filtering that goes on in bringing whatever is in that deep space into physical manifestation.
Mm-hmm. Well, okay, so now we've summarized the flicker filter model, but I think it's important to review, for the benefit of our viewers, some of the problems that you've identified with the whole notion of either materialism or physicalism. And in your book, you do a very elegant job of that, starting with the whole history of the idea of materialism.
Well, thank you, Jeffrey. I appreciate that you feel that it was a convincing argument. I've had a lot of practice at it. I have years ago I published a philosophy paper, Some Fundamental Problems with a Materialist Interpretation of Reality. So I've been at this for a long time, and have carefully reviewed all of the arguments for and against materialism, and have had these arguments with materialists of various sorts for decades. So I understand the arguments very well, moving in both directions, which I think allows me to sort of try to more succinctly summarize everything. And then Julia was relentless in forcing me to clarify everything as well. So, I mean, it was very, very important in terms of moving forward some kind of lucid sort of analysis of materialism.
You begin by talking about how at one time in history, and I think many people today still imagine materialism sort of using the metaphor of billiard balls, that atoms and molecules are like billiard balls.
That was explicitly a model that was developed historically in the Western intellectual tradition. And so not only do we carry that forward in the Western intellectual tradition, but as we know, as psychologists, we realize that people use schemata for organizing the way in which they understand reality. So, when we think bird, we don't think, of the genetic makeup of birds. We just have a prototype of a robin in our heads, and then we just compare what comes along to the robin and go like, well, that's not a bird because it doesn't look like a robin. So that's how we reason, right? We use all these reasoning heuristics. We don't actually think things through ordinarily. I mean, you need philosophers. Philosophers do that. They sit down and think things through, and then nobody can understand what they said because it becomes so complicated. Yeah. So I think one of the things that happens, and there's almost no research on this, one of my thesis students looked at it a little bit, is that we tend to use a billiard ball schema for organizing reality. So when we think about something, is that real? We think, well, everything is like billiard balls, sort of banging into one another and kind of moving backward and forward in time in some kind of deterministic way. And if it doesn't fit that, then we go, well, obviously that can't happen. So it's like, so, you say, well, the survival hypothesis, is it possible for there to be the continuation of consciousness after death, physical death? Well, that's an open question. That's a scientific question. Then you say, well, what methodology are we going to use for answering that question? But if you've already got this schemata that, everything is bumping billiard balls, you go, well, wait a minute, the billiard balls stop bumping, there's nothing happening. Yeah. And so you don't even think that there's any point in investigating that because your schema doesn't allow that. Your schema already precludes the idea that consciousness could survive death because there's just bumping billiard balls, and what does that have to do with bumping billiard balls? There's nothing there, you know.
And the irony is, of course, we know today in physics that fundamental particles are nothing like billiard balls.
Oh goodness, no, we have no idea what they are. I mean, that's one of the famous quotations for Richard Feynman. Like, if you think that you're going to use your ideas about how reality works at this level for understanding quantum phenomena, then you're simply going to miss it. You're going to miss it.
People today, and I've interviewed some, have often said, "Well, I'm no longer a materialist. I'm a physicalist," as if that provides a more sophisticated response. And you really torn that argument into shreds.
Yeah, there's nothing there. I mean, what does that mean?
Yeah.
Like, I'm a physical. What does that mean even? Like, one version of that is, well, it means whatever physicists say reality is like, but they obviously haven't talked to very many physicists, because when you go in the physics community, the physicists who do theoretical physics don't agree with one another. So what kind of version of reality what does that mean then? And so usually what happens is that people default back to their schemata. Like, they think, oh, physicists must think that the universe is like bumping billiard balls, and therefore I'm going to say that the universe is physical in nature. But of course the physicists don't think that. And so, and trying to track what they think and where they're going with it. I mean, the other thing, and this isn't even, it's funny, but it also happens regularly, that when you ask a theoretical physicist, somebody who does quantum field theory, for example, so what does this mean? Like, what does this tell us about the universe? And they laugh. No, I don't say anything about that. I don't know anything about that. Shut up and calculate. And that's basically the attitude. You can either do the mathematics, which is what you do, and that's your livelihood. You do the mathematics, and you just go along with it, or you try to think about it. And if you think about it, most people who think about it don't understand the mathematics, and so they're thinking about it. But how are you going to think about it? You're going to think about it using analogies, but the waves, the particles, those analogies, all of those analogies fail. And so what is it? We don't know. It's mysterious. It's something really weird.
On top of that, you have a number of physicists who are starting with people like Max Planck, one of the founders of quantum mechanics, who suggested that consciousness itself is fundamental.
Well, exactly. So it's just a question of which physicists you're going to listen to. And you listen to the right ones, and they'll tell you that there's nothing down there, that it's all mind.
Yeah. So you've argued, actually, that physicalism could be another way of sneaking mentalism or idealism into the metaphysical picture.
Exactly, without knowing it. So it's just kind of fun watching people do that.
And the other thing that you address, after having sort of shredded the whole edifice of materialism or physicalism, you begin to look at time itself and our understanding of time.
When Julie and I first got together, she has a background in doing research on time, and I had been thinking about time for years, that I really needed to sit down and think about it. I hadn't thought about it. I thought about thinking about it. And so we decided to write a paper about time, and that became chapter 3 of the book. Then we decided, okay, let's just do a whole book then. But that was I feel that in the whole book, in a way, that is really our sort of scholarly contribution there, is in that particular chapter. And so what we did was we looked at time in physics, both in relativity theory, quantum theories. We looked at the neuroscience of time. We looked at the phenomenology of time. We looked at all the anomalous phenomena around time, the presentiment studies, those kinds of things, precognitive dreams. We looked at time in altered states, time under the influence of psychedelic drugs, time, and time as it's experienced by people who've had a near-death experience. And so just to give you an example of the kind of thing that we're talking about, sometimes after somebody's had a near-death experience, they will be sitting somewhere, just minding their own business, doing something. And one of my former students actually told me of this experience as well. So it's in the literature, and I've also heard firsthand or secondhand or whatever that would be from my students of having had this experience. So you're sitting somewhere, minding your own business, doing whatever it is you're doing with other people, and at the same time, you're now living your life forward. And you're living your life forward for 2, 3, 4 months into the future. And you're still sitting there talking to people, and all of this maybe takes about 10 minutes of your time. And then you go, whoa, that was crazy. What was that? And then when you get further on in your life, a couple of months later, this whole scenario that you already lived out starts up, and you live it out. Mm-hmm. That is completely crazy. I mean, that does not fit a, linear beads on a string version of time in any kind of sense. So taking into account those types of anomalous experiences, taking into account what happens during life reviews and near-death experiences, as well as all the neuroscience, the phenomenology, what people in physics say, and so on. So that's how we sort of churned everything over and decided that maybe Julian Barbour had the kind of the closest sense of what time might be like, mm-hmm. Which is this notion that there is only the present. There are only nows. These nows are organized in some kind of way at some deep level. And then it's a question of, well, how does that organization occur? And, what are the opportunities for manipulating it and so on.
I think it's useful to point out that what you've done here in a book published by the American Psychological Association is you're introducing a wide range of empirical studies that were pretty much considered taboo in the psychological community. And you've argued that this crumbling edifice of materialism is the reason why that taboo exists, and it ought not to.
Precisely, Jeffrey. When you look at the history of psychology, in the late 19th century, psychology included all of these interesting aspects. I mean, they talked about hypnosis, they talked about multiple personalities, they talked about mediumship, they talked about the survival of consciousness after death. They were interested in everything across the board. And in the early 1900s, all of the anomalous phenomena got chopped out of psychology, and it was just left kind of like this sort of naked, sort of ratty little skeleton, and that was it. And I think that what Julie and I are doing really is nothing other than re-establishing what psychology was in the first place. Mm-hmm. That there is a range of phenomena that are of interest when you look at the human psyche, and this is the subject matter for psychologists, and there is a great deal of material now about it, anomalous and not anomalous, and that we should look at all of it and consider all of it when we try to understand the psyche and understand what consciousness is.
Yeah, it seems as if psychologists are, in effect, handicapping themselves by studiously ignoring a vast body of data with direct relevance to the subject that they purport to study.
Exactly, Jeffrey. Exactly.
Yeah.
Well said.
Well, I think you've and Julia have done a fabulous job of reviewing all of that literature, and in particular precognition, because it strikes right at the very heart of important questions relating to the nature of time, nature of causality, the nature of free will.
Yes, definitely, and this is where the sort of where we get to the flicker filter theory, because you say, okay, well, we can explain how you can have precognition, but we can also show you how you can then change reality so that what you just saw is going to happen isn't going to happen anymore. So you're in this sort of very odd, ironic situation where, in my case, for example, I, as a PhD student, I started to establish the fact that some of my dreams were precognitive. And it takes a long time. I mean, you have to, you write the dream down. You say, this is what the dream says. This is what it predicts will happen. And then you check, did it happen or did it not happen? And it can take 10, 15, 20 years to say, okay, I think this is actually working. Mm-hmm. Then when you get that far, you go, okay, but I don't like that outcome. Like, I really don't want that. So then you say, okay, so how can I change it? So then you find ways to change it. And so now it's like you're no longer demonstrating precognition anymore because you've anticipated what is going to happen, and now you've decided you don't want it, and you change it. And so what happens in reality is not what you saw in the first place. And so ironically, you're using precognition in order to, in some sense, I guess in a narrow sense, invalidate it.
Right. It raises all kinds of potential logical paradoxes.
Yes. I mean, one way to think about it, one of the things that happened with the special theory of relativity was the spatialization of time. That time was added as a fourth dimension along with the spatial dimensions. If you do that and you regard the universe as being deterministic, then you get a block universe. So basically, everything that ever happened, anything that ever will happen, is already said and done, and it's all like sits in a big block. Mm-hmm. So it's a block universe. But a way to sort of free yourself from the determinism of that is to say, well, what if we switch between block universes? So we're switching out of that universe in which this precognitive dream showed me that, I was going to have a car accident or whatever, and move into a universe where that's not happening anymore. Mm-hmm. And so the idea here is that you can sort of have these sort of outdated notions of the way in which you think time works in these block universe and use them to think in creative ways that maybe what you're doing is you're actually moving between these. Maybe you're somehow you have the ability to negotiate reality. Mm-hmm.
Well, and the flicker filter model allows not only for precognition, but as you point out in your book, it also allows for the possibility of psychokinesis and even survival after death.
Oh yeah. I mean once you're on the other side of the filter, consciousness sits on the other side of the filter ultimately. Mm-hmm. So, and you are simply an extrusion of that.
And by consciousness, here I think you mean a larger consciousness than our normal ego consciousness.
Exactly, yeah. And we, at the beginning of the book, we give 4 different definitions of consciousness. We're dealing with that subjective aspect of that is sort of the core of what constitutes experience. And you sort of think of that as being sort of expanded or universalized somehow. Mm-hmm. And that is the kind of consciousness we're talking about here. Yeah, some kind of, and this is the sort of thing that that people would tap into during a transcendent state of consciousness, where they feel timelessness, spacelessness. They feel that they've been liberated from the usual constraints of reality, and they feel completely expanded. And in some cases, they literally talk about being able to pop into the time stream where they choose. Well, not necessarily maybe where they choose, but they don't necessarily pop into it in a linear order, mm-hmm. out of that deep consciousness. And we give some examples of that in the book. Mm-hmm.
And you even, of course, draw upon a lot of conventional research about subjective time that shows that experiences sometimes appear to take longer or to take less time than one might measure by the clock.
Oh, yes. Time gets stretched, twisted, turned. It doesn't perfectly match across modalities. One of the other things that we found very interesting, there's been considerable research trying to find time in the brain, and that has not happened yet. We do not know. There is no central time processor in the brain, mm-hmm. Which is kind of interesting. And yet there is temporal binding. Mm-hmm. And so And this is just another variation of the binding problem. We don't know how the sensory modalities get bound, and we don't know how temporality, especially across modalities, gets bound.
Now, we better define for our viewers the binding problem. I know amongst researchers it's very important, but for the lay public, very few people have heard about the binding problem.
Think about the way in which the senses process stimuli that impinge on the physical body. So light hits the retina of the eye. Longitudinal sound waves impact the eardrum. You put your hand out and you touch the keyboard, and there are corpuscles and so on in the fingers that relay information up the spine into the brain. And that's all over the place. I mean, this is a bit here, a bit there, a little something here, a little, nonsense going on. I mean, even just think about the eyeball. I mean, it's filled with what? This murky fluid? Once you put light through a murky fluid, by the time it's gone through the murky fluid, it's just like all over the place. How do you ever see a vertical line? The only way you see a vertical line is because the brain reconstructs what that must have been and tells you, oh, that must be a vertical line. But the problem is that with all this murky, garbled stuff coming in all over the place, how is it that we experience a single unitary conscious experience? Mm-hmm. This is a mystery that no one has been able to solve.
Because we have 100 billion neurons functioning in the brain, all of them processing different kinds of information, and there's no reason on the surface that any of it should appear to be coherent.
Yes, and that's right. That any of it should be coherent, that any of it should coalesce into a single unitary experience with qualia. And qualia means with the sense of something going on. Mm-hmm. This is not a problem that anyone has solved.
And that's considered like the big problem amongst conventional neuroscientists, is to understand how the brain is able to organize all of these inputs into what ultimately comes down to not only a coherent picture, but actually a narrative for people.
Yes, yeah, it is. It is one of the big problems.
Mm-hmm. And I know a lot of conventional neuroscientists seem to think, well, once we solve the binding problem, then we'll have a complete picture of consciousness.
Yeah.
I think they're giving up on that, though generally one of the points you make in your book is that there's really a growing consensus amongst neuroscientists and physical scientists and biological scientists in general that we're entering into what you call a post-materialist worldview.
I think that, and I'm not trying to, I'm not in a position to make a really good assessment of this, but I think that increasingly neuroscientists are running out of gas. I mean, the computational program ran out of gas, which is why people have sort of defaulted back to the neuroscience position. The computational position, by the way, was that consciousness arises out of proper types of calculations.
Yeah.
And that gets away from some very obvious problems that, well, what if you think you see red and it's this nerve cell doing it and you destroy the nerve cell but you still see red, then, obviously it's not that particular nerve cell. Well, then what is it? And so then you have the notion of functionalism or computationalism, that what matters is not which part of the brain is doing, but the fact that these calculations are being carried out. So then we got into that whole computational sort of program that went on for quite a while, and then sort of that one, people just couldn't make it work. So they kind of said, okay, well, we're not doing that anymore. Now we're doing neuroscience because we've actually got nerve cells in the brain, and somehow those nerve cells, through some kind of calculating process, are producing experience.
Yeah.
So they're back to the old problems without the kind of the easy fix of computationalism.
Mm-hmm. And the problem is they're left with what David Chalmers calls the hard problem of consciousness, which is how do you get qualia, or actual experience, the subjective sense of I exist, from neurons? Yeah,
exactly. So even if you could solve the binding problem, you still have the hard problem. Mm-hmm. And there's no you just get these sort of hand-waving emergentist arguments that, well, this is just what it's like when, enough neurons calculate things. But you don't know that. You don't have any evidence for that. You don't know if that's really what's happening, because you can't prove it. So it's just kind of, there's these hand-waving arguments, and more people are just saying, well, look, I mean, the whole point of discussing the physical world as the physical world was to remove any aspect or element of subjectivity or experience from it. So you've stripped it of anything that has anything to do with subjectivity. That is now going to be our objective world. Now you develop your physics and all the rest of it, and you learn how to do that really well. And now you say, oh, now we're going to put subjectivity back into it. Well, wait a minute. Hold on. You just carefully stripped it of any possibility of subjectivity so that you could have your little objective world. Yeah. So now you're going to put it back in? Well, how is it going to go in? Because you so carefully stripped it out. You can't put it back in. It's not just going to show up. And this is the big problem, that the physicalist theories, consciousness is an embarrassment. Like it's, the universe could perfectly well run in the dark, but it's not running in the dark because there's the light of consciousness. So why is it there? What's it doing there? How did it get there? What's creating it? Where's it coming from?
And the flicker filter model that you have presupposes that consciousness was always there to begin with at some level.
Right. So we flipped the problem. I mean, we haven't really solved anything. I mean, nobody can solve anything anyway. But we flipped the problem. Now it's like, okay, everything's made out of consciousness. So, and then you say, well, where did that come from? Well, I don't know.
But at least
it's self-existent.
It gives you a scientific model that lets you incorporate a vast body of data that is otherwise being swept under the rug.
Yes, and that's the purpose of a model. It's not necessarily that it's a correct picture of reality. It's that it has the best goodness of fit to the data. Mm-hmm. That's what you're always looking for. You're always looking for the theory with the best goodness of fit. And Julie and I say that, like at the end of the book, that we're perfectly confident that someday our theory will be tossed out because somebody will realize that there is a much better explanation for what's going on. So that's all you're ever able to do, is to come up with, a theory with the best goodness of fit to empirical observation as a scientist.
Mm-hmm. Now, I know, for example, you do deal extensively with psychokinesis in your book. That's a big interest of mine. And maybe you could talk a little bit about how psychokinesis, or mind over matter, would work in the context of the flicker filter model.
Well, I think in the most dramatic case, and we give some examples from observations that have been made of Tomás.
Brazilian medium.
Brazilian something or other.
Studied extensively by my dear friend Lee Poulos.
Lee Poulos is wonderful, yes. We have had some really good conversations with Lee.
A fellow Canadian.
Yes, fellow Canadian. He's a clinical psychologist in Vancouver. Has studied Tomás, and it was Gary Lachman, I believe, who was the American...
Gary Richmond.
Gary Richmond, sorry.
Yeah, Gary Lachman is another scholar of the esoteric who has been a frequent guest on this program, so I can understand the confusion.
Who was a photographer as well as, a journalist who spent considerable time with Tomás. Well, I think what's important, I think probably the thing to say here is that Tomás was able to ostensibly demonstrate phenomena that do not make any sense in any kind of mechanical way. So, for instance, somebody would cut now I'm not going to remember. It's a 500 Queiroz note, It's a basically
a Brazilian currency.
Brazilian currency, paper. Brazilian paper currency. Cut it into 4 pieces. Have the person, not himself, but someone else, hold it in his or her hand, do his raw thing, and the person opens the hand, and the currency has been reconstituted, but in the wrong order. And you think like, okay, well, that didn't happen. But if you think, well, what if it did, since people ostensibly are carrying these around with them and it's been witnessed by credible witnesses, how would you explain it? And so in the flicker filter theory, it's not an issue at all, because you go to the deep state. You're going to the deep state constantly anyway.
The deep state of consciousness.
The deep state. So this would be deep consciousness, the pre-physical substrate. So basically, when the universe is in the off position, so it's in the on, off, on, off, on, off. So when you're in the off position, you just go, well, let's just pull out this now. So you pull the now off the shelf that has, the currency, put together in this weird order, and you plop that one down. That becomes your now.
It suggests almost a power of omniscience or omnipotence.
Yes, exactly. And this is, I think this is very important, because you sort of see this progression that people have made. Like they say, oh, well, you know what? It's not matter, it's energy. Everything is energy. And then they go, oh, well, you know what? It's not really energy that's doing it. It's information. It's the information that you're jiggling and that you're changing or something like that. Notice that requires less effort. But then, like I'm saying, well, we haven't gone far enough. We can actually go one more step, and that is that it's not information, it's meaning. And if you jiggle the meaning, in this case, you're switching out the meaning fields. And if you can jiggle the meaning, notice how little work is required. So in order to create these kinds of psychokinetic effects, like people sometimes think that you need to have this massive power of the mind, and you're crunching things together, and you're creating all these impact of powerful forces at some level. But maybe it's not like that at all. Maybe it's just as simple as, a tiny, tiny movement of the mind, and everything is completely different. And it's completely different because because you've figured out how you can create that change in the off position. And so you basically selected a different now. And so when the now comes down, it comes down with the currency put back together in the wrong order, and everybody goes, well, how did that happen?
Of course, people like Tomas are extremely rare, and on top of being extremely rare, the things they do are so unbelievable that even an open-minded person may have a very hard time integrating or digesting what they've just witnessed.
That's right, yes. And of course, I'm familiar with your investigation of Ted Owens, who was, one of these sort of charismatic figures who had these sorts of capabilities, and just how unbelievable it is to imagine that anybody could have done the kinds of things that he did. Yeah. So we talk about the boggle threshold in the book, and everybody has a boggle threshold. Yeah. And this is sort of the level of anomaly that they are willing to accept and no more. So it could be like, well, yeah, maybe sometimes there is some telepathy, but that could be explained by some kind of electromagnetic waves that are moving out of the person's brain into the other person. And then you go, okay, fine, I'm okay with that. Maybe sometimes somebody might be able to jiggle a reg, the random event generator, a tiny, tiny little bit, but it's inconsequential. It doesn't matter. It's not anything. It's like, I don't know why it happens, but it might happen. But certainly there are no aliens out there, and there's no life after death, and nobody can actually make eggs hatch and little chickens run around in 17 minutes.
Which is something that Tomas was reported to have done.
Yes, exactly. And so so everybody has a boggle threshold, and then when you get to the point where, okay, I'm willing to accept this, but not this. And so once you actually realize that that's the process, John Lilly used to talk about that, by the way, like in his Center of the Cyclone, where he says that is really the only restriction on what you can see in reality. is what the limits of your own beliefs are.
Mm-hmm.
And so as you start to relinquish and release what you think is possible, what you think isn't possible, you acknowledge that you have a boggle threshold. And what if you can go past that boggle threshold? What if you can imagine that something else could occur? And then you start seeing even stranger things, and even stranger sorts of things start happening. It's like the universe just comes apart. And this is why I feel like why I've sort of been talking about my theory of meaning fields. The meaning fields to hold it together, because there's nothing left to hold anything together.
Yeah. Let me tell you a brief story that is relevant to this point. I remember some 30, 40 years ago, I had a copy of the book by Lee Poulos with Gary Richmond about Tomas. I think it was called Miracles and Other Realities. And I was reading it to my mentor, Arthur M. Young, a theorist, inventor of the Bell helicopter, and a man deeply involved in funding parapsychology and studying alchemy, and totally open-minded. And I was reading a passage in which they were describing a session with Tomas in which there were metal folding chairs, and the big metal folding chair started melting right in front of them, and not because it was hot or anything. And Arthur Young, one of the most open-minded people I ever knew, yelled at me. He says, "Stop, stop." He said, "I can't take it anymore."
Yes, and this is why in Chapter 7, Julie and I spent so much time talking about how to incorporate subjectivity into the study of consciousness. And one of the really key aspects of that is the importance of self-development.
Mm-hmm.
The importance of researchers transforming themselves so that they are capable of seeing things the way they are. They're capable of thinking logically. They're capable of neutralizing their biases as much as possible. They're capable of interacting with phenomena in a way that doesn't skew, twist, and negate and nullify the kinds of things that they're actually looking at or that they're investigating. And I think that is a really, really core aspect, something that I emphasize with my students. The core aspect of being a good scientist is self-development, learning how to develop yourself so that you can encounter phenomena, learn from them, document them properly, relay all of that to the scientific community and through the proper channels so that we can sort of move our understanding of consciousness and reality forward.
You point out that psychology was originally based on the methodology of introspection, and then that was abandoned with the development of behaviorism, and now you talk about the need for a new type of introspection in psychology.
I'm not sure if it's new.
It might actually be quite ancient.
I know, exactly. I mean, it's, well, okay, there are two aspects to this. One is that I think that understanding introspection and introspective techniques already depends upon a particular theory of mind that we have, right? And our theories of mind might be wrong. Mm-hmm. This is something that's been making the rounds lately in cognitive psychology and so on, the whole notion of theory of mind and how people use theory of mind for interacting with other people. So our ideas about introspection are probably badly flawed anyway. And so if you start and you go, okay, let me introspect, and you go, well, what am I doing anyway? What am I supposed to be doing? What am I trying to do? How can I look at myself? I mean, I think that this is why sort of behaviorism took over, because it's difficult. It's not easy to do. It's not that people couldn't do it. It's just that it was difficult to do, and some people there were other things they wanted to look at and think about, and so they just pushed forward that agenda, which I think is perfectly legitimate. So that's the one part. The other part, which brings the anomalous ingredients and aspects back in, is the part of shared mind, that you can get to a point where you can actually experience what the other person is experiencing. You can tell what their experience is. And so you're sharing in that shared mind with another person. I don't know if this is just a myth, an urban myth, or whether this was something that he was thinking of. Of course, we talk about Sigmund Freud a little bit in chapter 2 and his ambivalence towards telepathy. That the whole psychoanalytic method of tracking the person's unconscious actually involved such clairvoyant ability or telepathic ability. That was actually at the heart of it. That's what you're doing while the person is looking at the ceiling, which is an ambiguous stimulus, and talking about whatever is happening in her mind. You're tracking the movement of the unconscious, and you're tracking it through sort of sharing the experience that the person is having directly. So I think that, and we didn't get into that at all in the book, because there were lots of things we had to leave out because they would have gone a little past most people's boggle thresholds. Yeah, exactly. He was very protective of what the sort of the institutionalization of his way of thinking about the psyche that he was trying to create. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think that is where the frontier lies, is in individuals introspecting and understanding what it is that they are finding, and that we become the instruments, we become the microscopes, the telescopes, we become the observers. And now you get back to Charlie Tart's state-specific science. It's that what you're doing is you have investigators that could agree on what it is that they found, or disagree on what it is that they found, or bringing back information for the remainder of the scientific community from their own investigations or explorations.
Well, you seem to be suggesting that the very process of introspection is akin to the process of telepathy in some way, reading the mind of another person.
I've written a new book, and I get into this a little bit in chapter 5. And one of the things I wonder about is whether our own view of the mind, the way we look at our own mind, is actually the same as what we do when we're doing remote viewing. Mm-hmm. In other words, you can't look at your own mind because you are your own mind, you are the subject. But what if you're using your capacity for telepathy or clairvoyance to look at your own mind, and that's actually what's involved in successful introspection?
That's a fascinating suggestion. I can't wait to read your new book.
Well, yes, as soon as we can get it published by someone.
Yeah, we'll have to do another whole interview just on that very thought, because it seems extremely provocative and potentially groundbreaking.
See, what's happened historically is that nobody's really taken non-local mind seriously. Because everybody's so attached to the materialist version of reality and sort of the skull encased notion of consciousness. Once you break it open and you say, okay, non-local phenomena exist, then all of these kinds of permutations become apparent to you. And you go, well, is that happening? Like, is that happening? Can I actually remote view my own mind? That's one of the, possibilities. And in terms of, the regs, like, wait a minute, if the person sitting in front of us is affecting it, well, so is the researcher. Well, so is the person reading the paper about this later. So
you're talking about a random event generator now.
A random event generator. I've had students in my lab playing with the random event generator. We've got some very interesting results. And like, who's influencing it? Discarnate entities could be influencing it. In fact, we did a study, Experiment 3+, in which we basically said, okay, we're not going to try to influence it. Discarnate entities, you do it.
Uh-huh.
So now you see this is starting to squish into ITC, instrumental transcommunication. The notion that discarded entities could influence electronic devices. So where does where does a psychokinesis experiment end and an ITC experiment begin?
Mm-hmm.
They blur,
it's
when
a huge problem.
One of the participants in experiment 3, in fact, what she did was at one point she just went fine. Like, she's a Reiki healer, so she goes fine. I'll just use my healing masters to move this thing. Why am I doing it?
Yeah. Well, and the argument that some people make is that these discarnate entities are like psychological props that individuals use because they don't want to have to feel at the ego level responsible for producing psychokinesis. So if you say, oh, I've got a spirit guide or an ancestor or a deity or some other entity, then the psychokinetic events can happen and you don't have to feel personally responsible.
I'm sure a lot of that goes on.
Yeah.
But that doesn't rule out the fact that there could be other beings.
This is the amazing thing that you've written a book published by the American Psychological Association in which you seriously look at the question, are discarnate entities real? Are there ways that we can model that scientifically?
Yes, we did that.
Yeah.
It was a lot of fun.
And you're suggesting that the flicker filter model does allow for discarnate entities.
Of course. Mm-hmm. Yes. We might need to flesh out the model a little bit by having multiple layers, for example, so that you can go to a layer where you have discarnate entities, but it's not a deep consciousness. Okay. You can also have entities in deep consciousness. There's a paper by Federico Fagin where he says physical reality is a byproduct of the communication of entities we can't see. Mm-hmm. So it's like...
Well, I just have to commend you because you're willing to take such a bold look at the data, and at the same time you're very careful to develop models that are grounded in the empirical database of psychology, neurology, and even physics and mathematics. So it's very, very important work that you're doing, Imants.
Thank you. I do my best.
You're doing an excellent job, and I look forward to the possibility of having future discussions with you because I know we're just scratching the surface right now.
Let's do it, Jeffrey.
Very comprehensive work. Thank you so much for being with me.
It was fun. Yeah. I enjoyed it.
Book 3 in the new Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
You can now download a free PDF copy of issue 7 of the new Thinking Aloud magazine or order a beautiful printed copy.